I think hiring is one of the most crucial things that we do, and I would also venture to say it's probably one of our least favorite things to do, right? Like everybody generally hates. And I think what I found is the most of the reason why we hate hiring is because we suck at it, right? And I don't mean that in a really negative way. It's really, really hard to hire, right? How can I know when we hired that guy 3 months ago that he was going to talk bad about customers? Nobody's going to tell you that in an interview, right? We just had another guy that we hired him, and 2 weeks later his old job counter offered him. And in that 2 weeks, we figured out that he was forgetful. I don't know how to interview for that, to be honest, right? And so I can't interview, like he didn't put the screws in the back of a laptop when he was done, and he forgot where he put a battery for a customer, and we sent in a hard drive under warranty, and when it came back, it didn't have a hard drive in it, and he didn't know if he sent the hard drive in or not, right? Like I don't know how to interview for some of those things, but what I can tell you to do, and what we figured out is how we can interview for the basic, like can they learn well, are they trainable, the different, are they going to be generally good at customer service, those kinds of things, which are the really, really key important parts. And so then hopefully we can hire well and then not have to fire people as much or as often or whatever, or churn through it. We can have people that'll provide really good customer support for our businesses. Because the way I look at it is we've built this big green field. This is our business, right? We've built this beautiful place that we have, and we want to invite the right people into it, because the problem is if you invite the wrong people, if a bunch of jackasses come in, they start pissing on your grass, and it all starts to die. And so what we want to do is not have this, right? Which seems really obvious to everybody, but then the big question becomes, how in the world do I actually do that? How do we actually create the dividers that we need to and filter and segment and get people in that will help us regrow our green grass or just not piss all over it and kill it all off? And so if that's what we're looking for, then that's what we got to do it. So the biggest and easiest way I found is you build a fence, right? We have to find a way to build a fence to make sure that we can find ways to filter people through so that we don't hire bad people as much as possible. And the best way to not hire bad people is to get to know people. But I would venture to say, like, how many of you guys have one step in your interview process? Maybe two? Maybe got like 4, 5, 6? Good. So a bunch of you guys have got more, which is fantastic. But what I see a lot when I'm talking to people is that literally you're going to pay somebody anywhere from $40,000 to $100,000 a year, and you do it because you had coffee with them once, or a guy knew a guy, or you had one good conversation, maybe an interview, maybe two, but that was it, right? Like, so we're going to stake the most important and expensive things that we do on just a couple of random conversations. And so what we've turned our hiring process into is this. And so when we go through, like, there's a ton on this, and these slides are online. I mean, you guys take pictures and everything else, but the slides all up online. And so what we really do is we try to figure out a whole lot of stuff. And what's interesting is if you look at this, because you probably can't read it. So what are we going to need? Process improvement. What's some other stuff? Then post the job. So we're like 4 steps in before we even think about posting the job. Because the other thing I think that we find a lot is that we just hire almost out of emergency or out of urgency. Somebody quits, I need to replace them, right? It is hard to run a business where you're overstaffed and wildly profitable. Right? And so because of that, we tend to be staffed appropriately, and when somebody leaves, it stresses the team, and we don't want that, and then is that a good or bad experience for customers, and all of this stuff starts to come along with it. And so we tend to hire more in an emergency mode a lot of the time, and we usually also tend to just hire for the person that left, unless there's an obvious change that needs to happen. And so one of the first things I always say to figure out is what's the need? Right? So what is the actual need, and why are we actually hiring? And if you start doing some of this, I think you can improve your team as well. Because the other big piece I'll say about some of this, and I'll kind of throw this in here as we go, is that the other side of hiring to me is the career path. How are you training people? How are we making sure that they feel like they can move up? How do we feel like they've got a future there? Because if you got hired somewhere and they constantly hired engineers above you and you never felt like you get promoted, how long before you start looking for another job? As soon as that job feels repetitive or no longer useful to you or whatever it is, you're probably going to start looking for a different job. And it's just because there's no upward mobility. So the other side of this, I think, that becomes really, really important is that we can't just hire as a knee-jerk reaction a lot of the time of what it is. Because what it might be is you've hired, you've got your team, everybody's there, everybody's gotten better, and then a mid-level engineer quits. So we say, we got to go hire a mid-level engineer. Well, the people that you hired a year ago might actually be able to fill that role. And so if they can fill that role, it might be better off to go back and find those mid-level people or those entry-level people and say, hey, can you go get this cert? Or can you go do this in the next 60 days? And if you can, then I want to actually promote you and we'll hire somebody below you. Right? I'd rather pay you a few extra dollars, get you to that mid-level spot, and then we'll hire somebody that's entry-level and keep going. And now you can create upward mobility. which is a big piece of this, which doesn't necessarily fall into hiring, but I think very much falls into the team building side of all this. And so if you don't work on actively trying to make sure we're building the team and people have upward mobility and they feel like they can move on and they feel like they can move up, then they're going to do that somewhere else, right? They're going to get to a certain point and they're going to move on. And we actually talk about it. Like when I hire somebody, I go through and I talk about it. And so Paul Sissel talked about this in Producers Club, I don't know, 6 or 8 months ago or something like that. But he says a lot of the time what happens is that we build a staffing organization that's like this. We hire the engineers at the top and we hire the most of the highest paid people, which is the hardest way to make us profitable. And we do that because I don't have to manage them. They can figure out any problem. It's easy. I can just throw them into a situation. I can trust them. So we end up with this inverted pyramid where we have very few low-level techs that we're bringing in, and we have the most high-level techs. But what we need to have is the other way around. We need to have an actual pyramid with a training program and moving people up. So we're really, really honest with people. We say, hey, what we want to get out of you as a level 1 technician that we're hiring in is somewhere between 2 and 4 years. And if you're a rock star, we will do what we can to promote you, and we want to keep you longer than that. But the truth is, if I can bring you in and train you and give you education and knowledge, and you can help me get my problem solved for my customers and build this company, then somewhere between 2 and 4 years, you're probably going to leave. And that's okay. I'm totally okay with that. And so we've had a couple people in the last year that have left and doubled their salaries. And I am happy that somebody else is paying them that much because they're not worth it, right? But if I keep them, then I either have to try to match that and be scared that I'm going to lose these people that have tribal knowledge and everything else, or you have to start building these systems and processes around hiring, training, documentation, all of those other things so that you can have a really effective team you can plug people into. Like we had a guy, we got him his A+, his Net+, his Security+, got him a bunch of experience, and he left. He was making 50-something with us, and he left to work for a bank, and he's making 95 grand a year. And 100% he should go do that because he's not worth 95 grand a year. His job is terrible. I wouldn't love it. But it's life-changing money for him, right? And so I 100% go do that because even if his next job's 75 grand, I don't know that I want to pay him 75 grand. But we were able to go do that, and that's really good for him. And now I can use that story when I'm hiring somebody else to tell them, what I want you to do is come in and give me 2 to 4 years, and then if I can't pay you 95, somebody else will. And that's okay. Because what we want to do is have this be as mutually beneficial as possible. So I think if you really start looking at this and trying to figure out, what are we doing? Because sometimes if you're starting a new line of business, or you're really, really, really short on some skills, you might have to go do that, right? I was just talking to John DePero yesterday, our Chief Compliance Officer, and he's working on something where somebody might want to do a big Dynamics migration that could be worth millions of dollars. I don't have a Dynamics guy. I have to hire a Dynamics guy. I'm not going to promote somebody up to be a Dynamics guy, right? Like that's a totally different situation. But if I know it, I know exactly what I'm getting. And then what I don't have to worry about is, can you do Dynamics and, right? If we got that deal, I need a Dynamics person. That's it. I need you to do this. And then it's on us to go find the next project and the next project to keep him employed. And if we don't think we can do that, then maybe we make him a contract offer for a year or some other thing and figure out what it is that we need to do. But this is why I think this is really important, is what are we actually doing in the beginning becomes a really, really big question. And I think far too often I just see people knee-jerk and say, I need to replace the guy that left. And I think there's a huge opportunity in there to move people up, to promote people, to train people, to make sure you're building that kind of program in the company. Because even if you're 2 or 3 or 4 people, when people see that and they even can be involved in this, like you get the team together and say, what skills do we need? What do we need to hire for? People really like that. And then like I say, those, especially when you're smaller, those A players you can give the opportunity then to move them up. And that becomes a really, really big deal because upward mobility in a small company of 5 or 10 or 15 people is really hard to achieve. It just doesn't, right? I mean, it's where are you going to go? What's next, right? And so this becomes really, really important. So this is the first thing I always say to do is what's the need and why are you hiring? And then when you start figuring that out, making a list of what it is, you can start figuring out who fits into that and then what do we need to either internally arrange or get training for or do something different, but let's figure that out. And now I can go post a job and start thinking about those things. But even really, I guess, before posting the job, the other thing I always say is when we hire somebody, for the most part, especially for growth, right? You just have been growing, you need to hire somebody. There's a point where somebody is useful and fully utilized, right? And usually somewhere between 45 and 90 days, somebody is mostly totally useful, like you can trust them to do things, but they aren't fully utilized. You haven't grown enough that you need to do it. And so what I always say is there's two questions. How do we get better? And you have to go back and ask your staff and say, well, there's two things. So employee onboarding, and this, I guess I just always say you should be working to improve this. So go to the last person you hired or other techs or whatever and just talk to them and say, how should we get better when we're going to hire somebody so we can make sure this is better? You know, that we greet them well, that they have stuff on their desk, that they, you know, like we give shock and awe to customers, and then we hand somebody a new laptop that was signed in as the last guy and say, fix that, right? Like, you know, way to start. So find ways that you can get better and figure out what pain points were for the last hires. Like one of the things we did is we just made a SharePoint site with links to everything, right? Because that was always the hard part is if you've been in the system for 6 months, you know where it's at. But when you're first there, the hardest part is trying to remember what's the name of IT Glue, or what's the name of the RMM, or where's the ticketing system, right? And so if we just made a SharePoint site that had links to all the different tools and dashboards and things that we use, and it made it really easy then for a new person to just go, I'm gonna start here. Like that's all I need to do. If I go to the SharePoint site, it's gonna have these links, I can find where I need to go from there, and I can ask less questions, and they feel more useful out of the gate. So some of them are really, really easy things to do. And then the other thing, and this is what I was kind of talking about, is the how do you get better? So as you start to see those employees get bandwidth, right, they can take work from other people, what can you go do to make your company better? And I think this is a huge opportunity, and this is part of, again, like I know this is hiring, but I think this is really about the team and everything else is what can we document, what can we standardize, what can we automate? Because that argument, I would say, if I asked you guys, everybody raise their hand or whatever, is like, who has time to do it now? And everybody would be like, I do not, right? Like that's the big problem is everybody feels like they don't have time to go actually improve what we're doing. But if you want to get better as a team, you have to do this stuff, especially the document and the standardize. And the automate's fantastic because hopefully that just makes it so you can wait longer to hire the next person. And so I think this becomes really important to kind of sit down and see what can we do, and then you have to keep your finger on that pulse once you hire that person, and once you feel like they're getting to that point, sometimes it's 30 days, sometimes it's longer, it depends again on who you hired and what they're doing, but once they get to that point where you feel like they are good enough that they can do these things on their own, start pulling people that can do this stuff, or have the new person do it, right? How good would it be to have the new person go standardize 10 of your environments? Like they're gonna know everything about those environments, right? But so as soon as you feel like they're capable enough to do that and not make mistakes and screw things up or whatever, have them start standardizing stuff in the half the time that they aren't doing other things or whatever it is. And if you can do it, everything starts to get better in the company. And so like that's again why I think I dump it into the hiring process, because up front, before we're interviewing and hiring anybody, it's better to figure this out, put reminders on your calendars and everything else, and make sure you're talking to people. And then as soon as you feel like that is opening up and you got some time, then go back and start standardizing and doing all the things you need to do. Now, if you're hiring to replace somebody, sometimes this is harder because that person was already working at a certain amount and you're just trying to get them back to doing it. But I would also go challenge and say, if you're doing it and they're coming along, can you do one of these things for one customer or something, right? Again, just build it into the process and try to say, hey, when this person gets back up to speed, let's take 2 weeks and go automate 3 things or whatever it is and come up with that list and figure out how to do it and make sure that you're kind of constantly improving.